You will notice tomorrow that there are two final papers on the course web. They will be treated just like all of the papers that have been up there so far have been. That is to say, they are for you to read for your interest, perhaps to help you better understand what's said in the lecture. The quizzes have never called on those papers as far as questions go. They're just, again, to help you perhaps better understand what's spoken about in the lectures. So today we're going to start out with this lecture, HIV/AIDS, and it more or less we'll finish up the immune response. We'll then go to the quiz, and immediately after the quiz, the break. There was and I guess that's just how we'll do it. And then after the break, I will briefly discuss the answers to quiz number 4. And then we'll go on to finish the lecture for this evening. We've got 3 more, including tonight, and I'm quite certain we'll get through what we have to get through, or what we intended to get through in those 3 lectures. Tonight, though, for example, this evening, I will probably not spend quite as much time on this, on one of the lectures. I guess that's the second after HIV/AIDS. We'll talk about flow inhibition in plants and animals, and I'll spend a little less time on that in animals. I'll skip right to the disease part of it. But let us begin by talking then about HIV/AIDS. And it is a relatively new disease in most parts of the world. But let's just take a brief moment to remember what we've had to say about this, and that is that cancer is related to our immune system, and that may have seemed not to make much sense initially, but then we saw that in fact the immune system does attack cancer cells. I'm going to just skip to that. That's the slide that we saw, and again, this is a cancer cell, and this is the T cell. That T cell is a very important part of the immune system, and we're going to spend a bit of time on it as we talk about HIV/AIDS. Also, I realized in chatting with a student after class last Friday that I may have left the impression that the only thing that T cells do is attack single cancer cells, and that's not the case. In fact, they can be working on developing cancer tumors from early on until they can get as large as 1 or 2 cubic centimeters in size, so a fairly decent size. You probably don't have any of these so far in your life. I hope you don't. But before you are 50 or so, you will be able to find, I'm probing one right now, tumors that got started but eventually got stopped. And a very common one, there's fat cells, very commonly will just go cancerous. But it's one that our immune system really deals well with, and we'll get at them very quickly. So that particular tumor will stop, but the immune system does not consume it as it does. It'll just stay there. It'll just be there maybe for the rest of your life, although it may happen, I'm told, in some cases, they can just suddenly disappear. But again, this is just a single cell that's being consumed. It doesn't happen when the tumor gets, when that cell takes off and becomes a small tumor. The important thing to remember is that the immune system really does do a good job of taking care of cancer. And for the most part, all of the cancer we get is taken care of by our immune system. We talked about the chemotherapy, and we talked about radiation therapy. Those are far less effective and our immune system is at dealing with cancer. We're going to continue on here, but it is necessary because we're going to be talking about a virus. In fact, we're going to be talking about it quite a bit. It's the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. And by the way, AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. But let's just remember very quickly what a virus is. You may have studied it before, you've certainly heard about it. And here it's defined very nicely. It's a non-cellular infectious agent. It consists of a protein coat wrapped around genetic material, and that can be either RNA or DNA, and a few enzymes. It's far smaller than any cell and doesn't have ribosomes or other metabolic machinery. That is to say, it can't make its own proteins, and so on. The important thing to remember about a virus is it hijacks the cell. It hijacks the cell, and the few genes that it does have take over the host's machinery, and they direct that machinery to make the virus. So it hijacks the cell, and that's going to come up again as we continue to talk about this. Virus, by now there are easily 1,000 viruses that have been pretty much, their structure has been pretty much defined, and these are just 4 of them. This is what the HIV virus looks like, and as you can see, it does what we were just talking about. It hijacks the cell. It gets in and takes over by putting some of its nucleic acid into the nucleic acid of the cell it's attacking. And the cell it's attacking is, in fact, in the case of HIV, the T cell. That T cell that is so important to our immune system. It takes over the machinery then. It puts itself into the chromosome that exists in the cell and makes it and makes itself. So that's what happens in the case of the virus. So remember this. You've seen this slide before. It's what's in the blood, and for the most part, we would think that the most important cells are these red cells. They're the ones that cart the oxygen and the CO2 around for the eventual production of and use of energy. But there are these other cells, and they are all of these white blood cells. And here's the one we're talking about right now. Here are the 3 that are involved in the immune system, and this T cell is so important in the immune system. It's the cellular immune response. There were 2 kinds, remember, and this is the cellular immune response. T cell is so important. If you wanted to do an experiment, to tell you how important the T cell was, the thing to do would be to figure out a way to get rid of all the T cells and then sit back and watch and see what happens to the organism. And that's, in fact, what the HIV virus does. It takes the T cell out of action. And very soon then you can begin to see what happens if you don't have those T cells. And that gives you a good sense of the importance of the T cells. Did you feel that laser in your ear? No, I guess he didn't feel it. That T cell is gone, and immediately you begin to see the effects. And those effects are what tell you what the importance is of that aspect of the immune response. And one of the first things that you see is this. It's a cancer. It's called it's actually Kaposi's sarcoma. Sarcoma just tumor, and it shows up. This tumor shows up. This, among a lot of other cancers, are the main effects of AIDS. And that's why lots of people, and in fact, if you look on your syllabus, you'll see that even I, when I was describing this problem, I referred to it as a cancer. AIDS itself and the problems that HIV cause are not they're not cancer, but what they do is cause the patient to get lots of cancer. Why? Because they are no longer suppressed. And that probably is the best evidence when I've said that the immune system is our best defense against AIDS. This is the best evidence we have, because you take away the immune system, or at least this important part of the immune system, and all of a sudden you're getting cancer all over the place. And cancer is not the only thing you get. That's not the only problem that our immune system solves, and we're going to touch on that in just a moment. You probably don't recognize this person because he died before you all were born, but his name, and furthermore, not from Taiwan. He was a movie star in America, and he died. His name was Rock Hudson, and he died in 1985. The reason that people remember his death especially is because when he got AIDS, it was either 1983 or 1984 that he said, "I have this disease." And that was a courageous thing to do at the time, because everybody viewed HIV/AIDS as a gay man's disease. Turns out that it gets around a bit more than that, but he came out and he said, if we're going to do anything about this disease, somebody's got to start. Somebody's got to come out and say, "I've got it, and I'm willing to do anything I can do to help solve this problem." So he died in 1985. And the way that he first discovered that he had AIDS was a friend of his said, just under your hairline on the back of your neck here, you've got something, and you've had it for a while. I don't know what it is exactly. Well, it was Kaposi's sarcoma. And so he had gotten this cancer that is people get Kaposi's sarcoma that do not have AIDS, but this happens to be one of the cancers that is very common among people that have AIDS. The disease was, I said that he announced this in 1983 or 1984, and that was very early on, because as far as you have something, why don't you tell the class what you were chatting about?
I was asking if the man got AIDS or cancer.
Very good. What do you get, AIDS or cancer? Is that the...
I mean, did he really get a cancer or AIDS, or is it because he got the AIDS that prompted the cancer to appear?
Yeah, that's what happens. You get AIDS, the virus attacks the T cell. That's not cancer, but that's what the virus does. It attacks the T cells. You lose the T cells, and when you lose the T cells, you get cancer. That's not the only thing you get, because you lose the T cells and you've got a lot of problems. And again, we're going to touch on that in just a moment. So anyway, so Rock Hudson is saying, I've got AIDS, and if I can do anything, if by my announcing that I've got AIDS, and therefore I'm announcing that I'm a gay man, I'm going to do it. And that was in 83 or 84. It was just a year or two before that the problem showed up in the U.S. In fact, it showed up in San Francisco, the western part of the U.S., and not just San Francisco, Los Angeles as well, and lots of people were dying from unusual causes, not just, and they didn't know exactly, the docs didn't know exactly what it was. But this is how it took off. It took off very quickly. I had an undergraduate student who actually did a paper on HIV/AIDS as a senior project. And by the time she finished working on that paper, she was very angry and upset, because as she looked back through the records and what docs were doing about this problem way back in these years, back in here, she said they weren't paying close attention to it at all. They didn't seem to care about it at all. And I think it's because it was a gay man's disease, and they just didn't think that was important enough for them to be spending their time on. I don't know if that's true or not. It certainly wasn't true by the time we got up in here where the disease was taking off. But it could have been early on. Who knows? It's caused, I said before, it's not just male sex. It's not just homosexuality that causes it. Essentially, that's the main cause. And in fact, these others are more or less the same problem. But of course, if somebody has AIDS and they also have a drug problem and they're using needles and they're sharing needles, the virus gets around. And so you can not be gay but get the disease if you're sharing needles. And there are lots of other related problems here as well. If you are given, this doesn't happen anymore, but again, early on, we weren't checking blood well enough when it was given for the use by other people. And so blood products can cause AIDS as well, and so on. How could heterosexual sex cause AIDS? Heterosexual, male, female. One of the partners has AIDS, and it can be either the male or the female that can transmit the problem. So this is 2006. These are 2006 data, and these are low numbers, to be sure, if you just do them by percentages. But you start thinking of what 1% of a billion is, and you get a big number, and that's the nature of the problem. What people have determined is that the virus actually was present only in simian species, monkeys, chimps, apes, but it escaped. It jumped, and that means that virus changed ever so slightly so that it suddenly could infect humans as well, and developed here in Africa. And Africa is still where the major problem is. So, is there any cure to AIDS? Every once in a while you'll see something in the paper that says, yeah, there's a cure. We finally got it under control. People can take medications and they can be okay. And they'll last for a long time, or maybe forever, the rest of their life. That, to my reading anyway, is not the case. This so-called AIDS cocktail that people use is actually a mixture of 4 different medicines. And these medicines do different things to inhibit the virus. The medicines do different things to inhibit the virus. And so everything that the virus does to infect the T cell is inhibited by the medicines in this AIDS cocktail. But the same thing happens here as happens with compounds that kill bacteria, antibiotics. And that is slowly, they are no good anymore. They don't work anymore for one reason or another. So this cocktail is a great thing on the landscape, no doubt about it. But it's not the solution, and it seems to slowly but surely be losing its effectiveness. So again, here's the problem, right down here. This is the cell, this T cell, that's inhibited, that is attacked by the virus. So like I was saying before, if you wanted to find out how important the T cells were The best experiment would be one where you could just simply kill all the T cells. And if you did that, you could then sit and watch and see what happens. And that's what happened, not by intention at all, but that's what happened. So these are the various transmission activities that cause it really is a matter of the fluids being transmitted from one person to another. And the virus is there. The virus just gets around in the body, and it's in all of the fluids that you'd expect. It's in mucus fluids, so any kind of sex, anal, vaginal, oral sex, blood transfusions, where you get the fluids from one person to another, dirty needles, fluid exchanges between a mother and a baby during pregnancy and in the uterus, breastfeeding, childbirth, any place where the fluids can get from one organism to another, and you've got the problem. So it's a growing disease, and it's still not solved. The one thing that has made a difference is that people realized that gay sex between males was a major problem. And as soon as sex was protected with condoms, for example, that caused a big drop-off. And those that were susceptible were very grateful for that knowledge. But as I said before, no known cure. Now, I've said a couple of times that it's not just cancers that these T cells protect us from. It's all kinds of other things. So what have we noticed in the case of people who have HIV/AIDS? What have we noticed with regard to the other kinds of diseases that they get? They don't die from the simple fact of the T cell not being there anymore. They die because the T cell was preventing all kinds of things that would kill us if the T cells weren't there. And so people that that have infected T cells get fevers and sweats and pneumonia and TB. I'm putting this up here for one particular reason. They get some things that we've already stressed. They get virtually every cancer you can imagine they will get. It seems like the first one that shows up is this Kaposi's sarcoma. But that's not the only one. There are all kinds of other cancers that they will get as well. And pneumonia, and TB, and certain problems with bone marrow, and lymph nodes, and the central nervous system. And here were two surprises. Dementia and bipolar disorder, that's manic depressive disease, they're more likely to get those as well. That begs the question, how much are those diseases caused by things that are not physical? And if in fact they aren't caused by things that aren't physical, then it really is telling us something about those two diseases and what causes them, but we don't know what exactly yet. You know, the bottom line when you read about the whole long list, this is just a small part of it, is that everything that can go wrong eventually seems to go wrong. If you watch close enough and long enough and the patient lives long enough, it seems like everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So the importance of those T cells, that part of the immune system, is extreme. It's extreme. The importance of the T cells. There was that other part of the the total immune response, the one that the B cells were involved in. That's important too, but there you're dealing with things like allergies and so on. It's not nearly the huge problem that losing T cells is. So that's the end of the immune system, and I think now you understand the connection of cancer and the immune system and HIV/AIDS. Now we're going to trying to think about the timing right here. I think we'll go into this next part before we stop. We're now going to talk, we're continuing to talk about diseases. We started that last section by talking about cancer. And once more, let me remind you, the way the topics were chosen for this the larger course, we're getting a kind of shortened version, is that people were asked, what are the things about biology that you think you should know about because they happen to be major issues. And that's how we came to do what we're doing. But now we're going to talk about impaired fluid flow. And we're going to start with plants. But when we're talking about impaired fluid flow, we are talking about blood for sure, and the inhibition of blood being able to flow the way it normally does. But we're also, and so that kind of disease could take place in veins or in arteries. But remember, there was that other one. Do you remember what that other one was? You. Yeah, you.
Remember what?
He was busy with your back. The other disease, the other problem with fluid flow. It's a guy with the lake, remember? Yeah, that's right. She's able to concentrate better when her back is being rubbed than you are rubbing her back. It was that elephantiasis. And I for some reason didn't put the picture in here, but that was where the fluid, the lymph gets around in the body not by a pump but by movement. And when a particular nematode, a roundworm, gets in the system, blocks those lymph ducts, the body says, uh-oh, we're not getting lymph to, let's say, the foot. And so we've got to produce more lymph. And it overproduces lymph, and you get this huge, in that case, it was this huge leg. And that's why it's referred to by the name of elephantiasis. That's what it looks like. Now, we're just going to spend, there are going to be a few slides on what happens in the case of plants, because this thing we're going to talk about, this inhibition of the veins and the arteries and the ducts, that same kind of thing can happen in plants. By this time, that shouldn't be a surprise to you, because plants and animals are so much alike. If this happens to be the end of a celery stalk, and these, in fact, are the vessels. That's what makes celery stringy. And those vessels, these vessels can get plugged up. And when the vessels get plugged up, the plant has a problem. These happen to be just, I'm going to skip through some of these very quickly. These are just the kinds of vessels that get plugged up. Xylem and phloem, they're called in plants. And here's some more pictures of them, and here's some more pictures of them. And eventually they can form a whole big stem, and it's the wood and the bark that are formed because of these. But the important thing is that here we have the xylem down here, and the phloem up here, and all of that. Those are vessels that get us water, but not just water, minerals and elements as well to the various parts of the plant. Sorry to skip ahead. Here's the disease. So what happens when it gets plugged up? Well, you know there's got to be a problem, right? Just like you know there's got to be a problem if you plug up the vessels in humans. In plants, one of the most important problems is something called Pierce's disease. Now, the only reason you'd consider this highly important is because it kills lots of different plants, but one of them is the grape plant. And I happen to live about 45 minutes from a little area of California called the Napa Valley. The Napa Valley is a strong and large grape growing area in the United States, and it's where the grapes come for the wine that's produced in the U.S. So what happens when these vessels get plugged up is at the tips of the leaf they start to brown. You can see it, the browning of the leaves here. But if you look in those vessels, here's what you find. Those are all bacteria. These are all bacteria. They're filling up with bacteria, and they eventually kill the plant because water and the elements, the nutrients that are carried along with the water are just not getting to the tips of the plant. And so the plant eventually dies because these are plugged up. And the question is, well, how do the bacteria get around? How do they get from plant to plant? And the answer to that is this guy right here. That's the common name for this is a leaf hopper. This happens to be a large leaf hopper and a strong flyer called the glassy winged sharpshooter, just again a leaf hopper. And you recognize that plant? Does anybody recognize that plant? Good. It's marijuana. And marijuana is susceptible to this disease. And in California right now, there's lots of marijuana that's grown for medical purposes. And here's again the guy. Now, the normal leaf hopper was this one, called a smoke tree sharpshooter. It's smaller, it doesn't fly as strongly. And it would attack the grapes, but it'd only get around the edges because it wasn't a strong flyer. This guy comes along, very strong flyer, can get to the center of the vineyard and spread the disease, this bacterial disease, without any problem at all. And that results in the plants dying. Now, the disease has not gotten up as far as the Napa Valley in California, but it did cause big problems in Southern California. Another disease like this, and this is the last one we'll do with plants, and then we'll go on to humans. This is not an atypical, it's pretty typical for campuses in the U.S., and it's called a quad, which stands for quadrangle. It's a square of green land that's in the middle of the campus generally. So it's open in here, but buildings around on this side over here and then around on this side over here. So it's called a quadrangle. And the favorite tree for these quadrangles throughout the U.S. was the American elm. The American elm. And that elm was susceptible to diseases. And this is a before and an after picture of a street that had these elms on them. And it just took out, this happens to have occurred partly during my lifetime when I was just a young child. And all of these streets that had these big, beautiful elms that would make tunnels out of the streets disappeared because they got this American elm disease. And so what you'd see is, this is the beginnings of the disease. You'd see branches out at the extremes, they would start to die, and eventually, and this is the same kind of thing that we saw before, and eventually they were dead, and they had to be cut down. So what were they dying of? Not a surprise. It was the plugging up of their vessels. Now, at first, one might be deceived, because if you look inside the wood, you find these tracks of this so-called American bark beetle, and these tracks went all over, and you would think that they were doing a lot of damage, but they didn't do enough damage at all to kill the trees. So and these beetles were just living in there because it was a great place to live. They lived under the bark, and they would sort of carve out their little places to be in the tree, and you could find their tracks all over. But what really killed the and this is that beetle. What really killed the elm tree was not this beetle and not those tracks that it was making, those tunnels that it was making as it crawled around, but rather it was a fungus that it carried with it, and the fungus would take off, and it would live in those vessels, and eventually it would block all of the vessels in the tree, and the tree would die. This is again not worth spending a lot of time on, but these are the little holes in the bark when the beetles would come out after they reproduced inside the tree. And here again is the beetle. And it's a disease that is spreading across the United States. This actually must go back 10, no, this is 2010. So it's pretty much wiped out the American elms in those parts of the country where they are most likely to live. You don't find American elms here in this half country. Yet another one, and now we're done. This is mistletoe. The interesting thing about mistletoe, it's something that's put out during the so-called Christmas holidays. If it's hung on a door and a woman is standing under the mistletoe in that doorway, the tradition is that any man that comes along can kiss this woman because she's standing under the mistletoe. And there are songs written about this and all of that. This is what it looks like. This is mistletoe. Those berries are tempting to pop in your mouth, so you have to keep it out of the way of children because they will make you very, very sick. They don't kill you, but they make you very, very sick. Okay, so that's this problem in plants. It gets much more personal, of course, when you start talking about the same kind of problem in animals. And that's what we'll talk about after we finish the quiz and the break. But the quiz first. Let's talk about, we're going to talk about two of the quizzes, and again, I'll go through them just very quickly. We're going to talk about quiz 3 and quiz 4, and this is the first question for quiz 3. Over time, science has discovered facts that seem to contradict certain religious facts. For example, I have this strange feeling that I discussed this with you, but not true. Okay, so here the possibilities are: the Earth was discovered by science to be much older. That's certainly true. The Earth was discovered by science to be a mere planet circling around a star rather than being the center of the universe. That was true as well. You remember Copernicus and Galileo. The fire inside the Earth was discovered by science to be a natural part of the Earth's construction, rather than hell, which is by at least two religions about which I know a destination for non-religious people for all eternity. And D was all three of the above, and that's the correct answer. The next question, and raise your hand if you have questions about any of these. The next is number 2. Which of the following statements about Darwin is false? Darwin was born into a relatively wealthy family. That was true. Remember, his father was a physician. Darwin never married. Not true. He married Emma Wedgwood. Darwin traveled around the world on a ship named the Beagle. True. Darwin co-authored a paper on evolution with Alfred Russel Wallace. That's true as well. By the way, on the last 2 quizzes, the class did unusually well. I really felt that you did much better than one would have expected. Number 3, Darwin knew of and studied many examples of human-controlled breeding in plants and animals. For example, he knew about the breeding of certain plants, horses, pigeons. Remember, that was strong in his mind. He studied human-controlled breeding of Galapagos finches. He didn't study that, actually, and it wasn't human-controlled. What he was studying there was something that was natural selection. He was very interested in Wedgwood china. Well, he might have been, but that's just kind of a silly answer. He did many breeding experiments himself with peas. That wasn't Darwin, that was Mendel. Fourth question. There are many interesting questions that surround the story of human evolution. For example, what does the different nature of Artes, remember that was Ardipithecus, feet tell us about her life in trees? That could be an interesting question. Did humans and Neanderthal man live on Earth at the same time? That too was an interesting question. And I talked briefly about, in fact, a series of books that was written based on that assumption. Was Archaeopteryx in the human evolutionary line? No. Remember, that was the thing that the reptile that suddenly was not suddenly, but started to take on bird characteristics. So two of the above. What does the different nature of Artie's feet tell us about her life in trees? Did humans and Neanderthal man live on Earth at the same time? So that was quiz number 3. And now we'll just go in the same way quickly through quiz number 4. Scientists and people generally talked about genes long before we knew what they were or where they were in our bodies. We talked about Darwin doing that and Mendel as well. But anyway, we knew, for example, that mothers and fathers passed on their physical characteristics to their babies. Animals and plants seemed to work similarly when it came to inheritance. Based on Mendel's work, we had at least 2 forms of each of our genes. Those are all true. So all of the above is the correct answer. Mendel's work on inheritance was widely recognized as soon as it was published. Well, we wish, and he wished, but that wasn't the case. It wasn't recognized for decades. Especially detailed in its description of chromosomes. One of the great things about Mendel's work is that he told us all this stuff about inheritance, and he never had a clue about what chromosomes were. C, unnoticed even by brilliant people like Darwin till after Mendel died. That was the case. And then D, almost all microscope work in the laboratory. That was not Mendel's work. Mendel's work was in the garden with the pea plants. Number 3, which of the following is not related to our early understanding of cells? Cross-sections of cork revealed the cell walls of plant cells. That was true. Hooke's first microscope was important in the study of the inner detail of cells. That's not what Hooke did. This is the correct answer, because that's not what Hooke did with his microscope. It wasn't strong enough to do that. In fact, what he did was make drawings of creatures that were just barely visible, and he made them much bigger. Cells of plants and animals were almost identical. Cells of green plants had chloroplasts, tiny green structures inside of them. So those were related to our early understanding of cells. And then the fourth one, which of the following statements is not true? Plant cells but not animal cells have nuclei. Wrong. Plants and animals are similar in virtually every detail and characteristic that you can imagine. And certainly that was one of them. They both have nuclei. Plant cells, but not animal cells, have chloroplasts. That is true. Ribosomes seem to be the platform on which proteins are made. That is true. Plant cells and animal cells both have chromosomes. That is true as well. Now, and so we're done with this, but I want to, if you cogitate and you think a little bit about some of this, and you just think that you put a different answer down, but you've got a good rationale for it. I've had, not lots, but certainly 10 students that have gotten in touch with me and said, you know, I think there's a good rationale for a different answer for that particular question. And half the time I've agreed. The rationale was decent. So if you think that you've got a better notion about what a particular answer should be, by all means get in touch with me, and we'll talk or we'll exchange emails, and in fact, your thinking might be right on the money. So now let's go to impaired fluid flow in humans. This gets more interesting, of course, because it's us that we're talking about, and probably everybody in this room knows somebody that has suffered from this problem of impaired fluid flow. That means you know that, what I'm saying there is that would mean that you know somebody who has had a stroke or a heart attack. And we'll talk just a little bit about these problems. What we're talking about is blocked vessels in animals, arteries, veins, or lymph ducts. And I didn't think I had a picture of this when we got to it before, but there he is. The man with the impaired flow in his lymph ducts. And this is a roundworm that just thinks it's a great life to be living in these nutrient-rich lymph ducts, and it causes the accumulation of lymph, as I described before. So that's one kind of problem, but that's not the one we're going to spend our time on. I'm going to start this part of the lecture, though, by talking about something that is a very clear case of our culture and our technology getting way out in front of evolution, because we have something that really does us harm, and that's our tongue. Our tongue tastes something sweet. This is a lecture that actually sits better in the U.S. than it might sit in Taiwan, because I've noticed it's probably to your very great benefit. You're not crazy about foods that are unusually sweet, but in any case, we're going to assume for the moment that that's a problem, because our tongue really latches on to things that are sweet, and we want to eat lots of things that are sweet. And furthermore, that's true for salty as well, and a few others, but let's just concentrate on those two things, sweet and salty. It makes sense. It makes sense if you think about our evolution. It makes sense that we would really like things that are sweet, because sweet things are high in carbohydrate, they're high in sugar, and sugar is a very quick source of energy. We can convert sugar quicker than anything else into energy for our body. So we like sweet things. When our ancestors, let's say 15,000 years ago and before that, when they ran into something that was sweet, their tongue said, eat a lot of this. Eat this up, because this is good for you. You need that energy. Remember, at that time, we didn't have ways. So I've gone back to times when I'm pretty sure that this is the case. They didn't have ways to purify sugar and make it in large amounts. Now it sits out more or less for free, right? I live in a building that has a Starbucks on the ground floor, and I was just thinking about this morning. So every morning, if I don't show up there one of these mornings, they're going to send out a search party, because I just go there all the time. And in this Starbucks, they have these bowls of sugar packets, and it's there. You can take as much as you want. So in essence, it's free. And that's true for salt as well. Salt shakers, all the salt you want. There was not all the salt you wanted at one point in time in our evolution, right? We weren't purifying salt just to put in salt shakers on the table or to make of it in restaurants. It was rare. It was one of the rare spices that came from the east to the west all those years ago. So those were things that were rare, and our tongue said, eat those things up. They are very good for you, and what you want to do is eat a lot of it, because they are important. So, gosh, I've been doing all this talking without showing you the tongue. Here's the tongue. And I'm sure you've learned this before. There are different parts of our tongue that taste different things. And here's sweet and salty and salty. And so our tongue is telling us, eat those things that are sweet and salty. And when I say that's gotten, our culture and our technology has gotten out in front of our evolution, that's what I mean. Our tongue is not doing us a favor when it says eat lots of sugar. It is not doing us a favor. That causes us problems and of various kinds. It doesn't do us well to take in large amounts of foods that are high in energy. And similarly, salty. Salt is absolutely essential to the functioning of our cells, and especially to nervous function. We need salt. Both the sodium and the chloride in salt are essential. So that's why our tongue, at a particular stage in our evolution, was telling us to eat those kinds of things. And we're going to come back to that because we'll see what the implications of that are. This just to remind us, you know this, we live with a circulatory system. That was a difference with the plants. They don't have a circulatory system. Virtually everything is the same, but it's not a circulatory system. Things don't go around and around and around, whereas in the case of animals, although the heart might be different, it's essentially, its function is to pump the fluid around in the body. So that's a circulatory system, and this is the pump that does the work. It is the heart. The vessels are the different colors. This is almost always true. If you see vessels shown in different colors, it's the red that's going to be the arteries, and the blue that's going to be the veins. And there are differences between them. It's the arteries that take the blood out from the heart, and the veins that generally bring it back. The blood eventually gets into capillary beds, and then it comes back, and the veins get bigger and bigger and bigger. But by that time, you've lost a lot of the pressure, and so what you need in those veins is valves, so that the fluid can only go one way. I've always tried to do this in class, and it never works. But you can show that you have veins in your artery. Look on the back of your hand. Can you see any arteries on the back of your hand? If you push the blood in that vein toward the tips of your fingers, the vein will stay flat. But as soon as you let your finger off, the vein will come up. That's because there are veins. That's because there are valves in there. If you do it the other way, it doesn't work that way at all. And now think about that for a while, and you'll understand that's because of these valves. So we have the valves where the pressure gets lower. That's relevant because how about the word varicose? You know that word varicose? It's where veins seem to expand, and unfortunately, it's especially true in the case of women who. During pregnancy, it can go away, but that's when it comes, or older women, and that's because those valves break down. The valves just don't work as well anymore, and so there's backflow, and that's why those veins get so big, because the blood accumulates there. Now, what goes wrong? Well, this is one thing that goes wrong, a heart attack. And as I said, I'm sure there are lots of people in here who know somebody who's had a heart attack. Heart attacks happen because the arteries that feed the heart, remember, of all the muscles we have, we can afford problems as far as blood circulation goes, but we can't afford it in our hearts. Our hearts are what keep the blood flowing, and so if we have one of those arteries that go to the heart to feed the heart plugged up, we've got a problem. And a heart attack can be the result. The other kind of difficulty is when we have this essentially the similar problem, but in the brain this time. Again, it's another place where you just don't want things to go wrong. Our brain is so important to the whole of our body, and is there a Chinese equivalent for the word stroke? Yeah? Okay, there are two different kinds of stroke, essentially. One of them is referred to as the hemorrhagic stroke, and that's where there's a burst in a vessel and blood leaks out. Another is where one of these vessels is blocked, and that's what's shown here. It's blocked, and so blood can't get out into here. Here, that you may have the same problem because there's a burst, and so blood may not be flowing where it should be. Now the next one is going to show these. I think this is true. They're the yeah. See here, this is the hemorrhagic stroke on this side, and the ischemic stroke on this side. This next slide actually has them reversed, but it shows the difficulty. You've got a blockage here, and all downstream from there, the brain dies because it's not getting its normal blood supply. And a similar kind of thing, although it's not, if you hear that somebody has a stroke, and you find out that they didn't have an ischemic stroke, they had a hemorrhagic stroke, it's probably better news. Neither of them is great news, but this one is more likely to be better news because you don't have a blockage of the blood flow, you just have blood leakage. And that can cause trouble, but more for the short term than for the long. Stroke is very interesting because it has different effects depending on what side of the brain that it has occurred on. If it occurs on the right side, you have one thing that's versus the left side. You know, the right side, it's the left side that's paralyzed. The left side, it's the right side that's paralyzed. But some of the other effects are different, which tells you the different activities in the brain, and so you can get different effects based on where the stroke has occurred. I want to spend a little time on this because I want you to. This is, you know, as you notice, I have a bias. Whenever there's a lot of money involved, you have to worry about whether or not you're getting good information. And it's because when a pharmaceutical company, for example, spends billions of dollars, they're going to have a bias in the matter. And I'm going to get into one of those cases where I've always been a little bit suspicious, and that has to do with cholesterol. Everybody hears high cholesterol, bad news. You got to worry about high cholesterol, and it causes plaque, and that's not good. Now, all of this is very rational. You think about it. Cholesterol flows around in the blood. Cholesterol is always present. You've got cholesterol flowing around in your blood right now. And the reason you have it is because you need it. You need cholesterol. It doesn't come just from high cholesterol foods. Your body makes cholesterol because your membranes absolutely require cholesterol. So if you had a measure of your blood and it had no cholesterol in it, that's big trouble. Cholesterol is essential to your life. So that's one fact. Another fact is that if you take a look at these plaques, these plugs that occur in both arteries and veins, by the way, they're high in cholesterol. Now, with those facts in mind, pharmaceutical companies went to work because we all felt that it was a good idea for them to go right to work, I should add, and they tried to figure out ways to lower the cholesterol. in our blood. And so you, again, you will hear of, not your friends, but perhaps your parents or somebody, you'll hear of them taking medications that will lower the cholesterol in the blood. And this is the rationale. If I lower the cholesterol in the blood, I will be less likely to have these plaques. But what are the facts of the matter? The facts of the matter are just don't quite line up with what we worry about, as I've just described them. In fact, cholesterol, if you lower your cholesterol, you don't by that fact lower the formation of plaque. That's one important fact. That doesn't happen. Furthermore, if you measure longevity, how long people live, doesn't make any, you can lower your cholesterol, doesn't make any difference how long you live. Doesn't make any difference at all. So lowering the even though it seems totally logical that lowering the cholesterol should have all of those positive effects, it doesn't. We don't live longer, and we don't have fewer heart attacks or fewer strokes, which is a good measure of plaque formation. So it's just good to think about. In the meantime, people will say, well, maybe we don't know for sure, but in the meantime, I'm going to take it just because I'm worried about the possibility. And so there are lots of medications that control cholesterol level in the blood. What statins are things that will lower cholesterol by inhibiting its synthesis. Now, you got to be thinking if you're going to inhibit synthesis, because remember, cholesterol is essential to our well-being. It's essential to membrane formation, and membrane formation is essential to our well-being. It's another one of those interesting little things that happens because it's rational, it's logical, it all makes all kinds of sense. But what do the facts tell us? So far, the facts aren't there. They may eventually show us that lowering cholesterol is a good idea, but right now, the evidence isn't there. Let me just spend a few minutes on this last problem. This is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's has become more and more common, not because there's some kind of strange chemical out there that's causing it to happen, but because people are living longer. And the longer you live, the more likely you are to get Alzheimer's or some kind of dementia. Dementia is it's a general category of disease that affects the brain. And the most obvious effect on the brain in diseases like this is that your memory starts to go. I may have mentioned this before, but if I did, I'm going to be mentioning it again. I remember when my mother-in-law showed the first signs of Alzheimer's. We were riding around, and it was fall, and the leaves were all brilliantly colored. And she said, I remember Ron, that was her youngest son, I remember Ron used to just love to ride around and look at the leaves and enjoy the leaves. And that was fine, and my wife happened to remember that as well. 10 minutes later, she said, I remember when Ron used to love to go out and see the leaves. And 10 minutes after that, she said, I remember when Ron used to love to go out and see the colored leaves in the fall. She was starting to have severe short-term memory problems. And eventually she died from Alzheimer's. You can define cruel in different ways, but you certainly can define it in a particular way that would put this at the top of the list. Because what happened to her over that 8 years of time was that her life essentially left her. Her body was still in great shape physically, She was in great shape. But her life left her. And it left her because, think about it, you know what's going to happen an hour from now because you know you've had experiences. You've been to this class before. Your whole life up to this time gives you all of these clues as to what's going to happen during the next hour or so. When you lose that, you have nothing left. You don't know why you're here. You don't know who these other organisms are around you, these other people. You don't know anything. And some of the behavioral reactions to that are very disturbing because people that you have loved for years and decades, you suddenly are cruel and mean to them. You just become a totally different person. And that's because of Alzheimer's. It seems to be a withering and a drying up of the brain. So you can make these comparisons, this cross-section here, or the whole brain. It's a cruel, cruel, cruel disease, something that I will never forget. There's one more thing I can show you about Alzheimer's. We don't really know very much about it, but we don't know much about the brain. We don't know much about how the brain does its processing. But there are some things associated with Alzheimer's that have been noticed, and one is that there are two kinds of proteins. One accumulates in the brain matrix, that is around the cells in the brain, and another accumulates in the cells. There are some other things that people have noticed, like for some strange and unusual reason, aluminum accumulates in Alzheimer's brains, aluminum. When this was first discovered, the sale of aluminum pots and pans went through the floor because people were frightened of it. Turns out that that's probably, it's not aluminum causing, it's aluminum accumulating in those cells because of their bad state of affairs. Okay, so that's all I will have to say about this. In the next two lectures, we're going to talk about genetic engineering and organic farming. That'll be in one lecture, and then we'll get to stem cells. Has anybody in the room heard about stem cells? Does anybody know what stem cells are? Yeah, tell me. Kathy, what's a stem cell?
They're like cells that can be turned into other cells that have specific functions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Stem cells still have everything available to be turned on. Every single gene can be turned on. For the most part, that's not the state of affairs of our cells. Remember, our cells, the genes get turned off as our cells develop. So stem cells are great research material. The question is, how do we get them? And that's where the controversy comes up. And we'll talk about that on Friday. And genetic engineering and organic farming and foods. We'll do that on Wednesday. And that's when I'll see you. Thank you.